Hello, this is DanPro. Welcome back to my train rigging tutorial series. And the last tutorial we actually got all of the wheels rotating correctly, and now we're going to do some more fun stuff, which is make these pistons go in and out. So let's start with, let me see here, get our armature and the correct layers here. What I want to start with is probably something that's a little bit easier, and that's going to be this connection rod. So I'm just going to temporarily hide this just so we can see what's happening. Let me actually hide this one and probably this one as well. You'll notice that there's a offset point on this wheel, so if we just kind of scrub through our animation, you'll notice it spinning. So basically what we want to do Alt H, unhide our connection rod, is we want to pick this point, and we are going to set up a bone so it will stay there and point straight across. So like I did earlier on my armature, I actually have those bones pre-set up so you don't have to watch me tabbing in and out of edit mode and snapping those bones. So I have this one here and this one here on frame 1. What I want you to pay attention to is this bone right here. Its head is at this pivot point, and this target bone, which when we add our constraint later, its head is at this spot right here. And I just stretched the tail of this bone over here to reach that point. So let's set up our parenting hierarchy and just see what happens with parenting alone. I want to parent this bone to this one. So that is our main drive wheel. Control P, keep offset, and I'm going to parent our target bone, or which will be our target when we add our constraint, to this bone, so it always stays at that point while this one rotates around. Control P, keep offset. Now let's just go back to pose mode, run our animation a little bit, and you'll notice that those bones, the head of those bones, stay exactly where we want them to at that offset position. Next, all we need to do is figure out a constraint that's going to keep this bone to point at that target over there, so it stays in line and straight as it rotates around. And that one, the constraint we're going to use is going to be the IK constraint. So I'm going to select this target, shift select our bone there. We want to point straight across, and shift control C. We are going to add constraint with targets, inverse kinematics. Now, the first thing we want to do for inverse kinematics, it's one of the, I think it's the only constraint that can actually work on multiple bones. So the first thing we need to do is check the chain length here. Now, chain length of 0 means that it's going to look at the parenting hierarchy and it's going to affect every bone until it can go back to the root bone, and in this case it is called the root bone here. So we only want this bone to affect this bone itself. We don't want it to affect this wheel as well. So what we need to do is change our chain length to 1, so this IK constraint only affects this bone right here. Basically what an IK constraint does is it always tries to point the tail of that bone to the target. It tries to make it stick there. It's going to try as hard as it can to do that. Let's run our animation here and see if that's what happens, and it does. So the head of this bone is staying at this offset, and it is pointing the tail of this bone at actually the head of this target over here. So even though this target is kind of spinning around in a weird way, we don't really have to worry about it. It's always trying to point it directly across there. Let me go back to frame 1. Let me see if I can get my mesh out here. Let's actually parent that connection rod to that bone if I can find it. It's this one here. Yep. Okay, just like we did before, we need to clear the parent from the other rig. Clear parent, keep transformation. We have unapplied transform, so Control A, apply location, rotation, and scale. And now we can parent that connection rod to this IK bone with Control P, set parent to bone. And now it's under control of our armature. And you can see that it's staying perfectly level all the way across, and that's exactly what we want. Next up, we're going to do this other set of meshes right here, and hopefully, maybe I'll just have to hide that connection mesh here for now, just so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Let's take a look at our animation, and remember the animation is that's actually being made by Trainboy 1's original rig, So all this stuff is still connected there. We'll just take a look at this piston, just moves in and out, and we've got this rod that's rotating here, and it's always pointing at this wobbling spot here. So I've already set up, let me turn that layer off, get our armature here. Let's find that layer. I've already set up 2 bones to represent those pivot points. So I've got one, its head is basically positioned so when the rod comes back, that's the furthest point back. Go back to frame 1 here. It is the tail of that bone is set right here, which is the pivot point for this rod, and then this bone stretches all the way to this pivot point, and we also have another target that's a little bit offset here from our other one here. It's just moved out, so these bones are in a line. Let's set up our parenting here before we add our constraints here and just see what we can do with that. Go to edit mode. I want to select this back one and parent it to our engine main with Control P, keep offset. I want to parent this target, which is going to be the target for that chain, to this one, that center wheel there at that offset spot there. Keep offset, and let's take a look at what our parenting does for this. Basically nothing. You don't see the bones doing anything. We actually need to make add our IK constraints to make these bones move a little bit. Let's go back to frame 1 here. Let's add our IK constraint. This is our target. We'll shift select this bone, which is, you always add the IK constraint on the last bone in the chain. We will do shift control C. We'll add constraints with targets just to save a little time here. Inverse kinematics. I want to immediately go to our constraints panel. Just like before, we don't want it to keep following that hierarchy all the way back with this chain length of 0. We want it to only affect these 2 bones here. So let's just run that animation and see what happens. And that's not what we want. It's flipping all over. Like I mentioned before, the IK constraint is the ultimate point at constraint. It's always trying to point the head of that its bone right at the target. And we know our target is parented to this wheel that's spinning around, so that target keeps moving around. So the cool thing about an IK constraint is not only can it affect multiple bones in a chain, we can tell it to do different things. So I'm going to select this first bone, go to bone properties, and then we'll find our inverse kinematics panel down here. Now this bone, all we want it to do is rotate up and down on a single axis, and that's going to be the X axis. So we can tell it not to rotate on Y and not to rotate on Z. This bone, we don't want it to do anything at all. We don't want it to rotate around its Y, Z, or X, so we can tell it not to do that. So let's see if that helps. Now it's kind of what we want. You'll notice that it's trying to point at that, but because this it's not moving backwards, it can't quite stop itself. So another cool thing about the IK constraint is it's not just a point at constraint, it can also be a combination stretch constraint. So this one, we don't want it to move up and down, but we can allow it to stretch. And let's see if that works. And you'll notice that is how we can get our piston to move back and forth. And this point is always going to stay, the length of this bone is always going to stay the same, and it's always going to point at that position, and it's always going to rotate from this point. So that is how we would do that. I'm going to show you that is actually going to cause us a problem though. So let me select this rod and this one. And just deselect all of these. Oops. Let me hide this bone here quick, just so I can select this, this, and that. That is what we're going to parent. So let's make sure we're on frame 1. We'll do Alt P, clear parent, keep transformation, and we have unapplied transform. So Control A, apply the location, rotation, and scale. So they are now set. We can actually parent them to the correct bones now. Let me select my armature and unhide those bones. So I want this rod to follow this bone. Control P, set parent to bone, and I want this rod and this piece to follow this backbone here. Control P, set parent to bone, Now let's see what happens here when we do that, because it's going to be a problem. You'll notice that this mesh is squishing in and out. Now I've mentioned this in the first tutorial. Once we parent a mesh to a bone, it's going to inherit its location, rotation, and scales, and that's what's happening right now. We don't actually want this, because this bone is stretching in and out on its y-axis. It's causing these meshes to deform, and we don't want that. Actually, the solution is very simple though. Before we do this, make sure we're on frame 1. Let's disconnect these two temporarily. We'll just Control P, Alt P rather, and we'll just clear the parent. And let's select our object, or our armature object. What I want to do is select this stretching bone. I'm going to do W, Subdivide. Next, I want to make sure that this is parented to that with connected, this is parented to that with connected, and this one is still parented to our engine main bone with connected. Whoops, not connected, offset. So it was already parented with, we can look at our bone constraints here, it was already parented there, not connected. Alright, let's go back to pose mode, and we need to change our chain length now that we have a chain length of 3 and not a chain length of 2. And again, let's go to our armature or inverse kinematics panel. This bone only needs to rotate on its x-axis. This bone actually is not going to be allowed to do anything. It can't rotate on either axis and is not going to stretch. And this one is not going to be able to rotate, but it is going to be allowed to stretch. And that is basically, whoops, if I play that animation, is going to give us a bone that doesn't stretch back and forth. It's basically just stuck between these two, and we can attach our meshes to that, and we won't have that mesh squishing problem. So we'll select this rod and this and parent it to that central bone there. Control P, set parent to bone. Now let's check our animation, and that is exactly what we want. So as you hopefully can see, the IK constraint is pretty powerful. It is not only a point at constraint, it can also affect multiple bones, and we can tell, get some pretty complex things going on here, because we can tell each bone in that chain what we want it to do. So very very useful. I actually should go through and rename these bones. This is going to be called MCH Comrade, and this one we want it to target. Where's our target here? Let's get back to frame 1 here. Here's our target. This bone is MCH Comrade 001. Oops, Comrade. Let's call it Comrade target .001. Just in case I have more of these. Alright. I want to, what is this called here? I just find, I'm not really a train guy, so let me find this crosshead. What's this one called? This mesh. Local drive rod. We'll just call this MCH Drive rod .001. Control C to copy that, Control V to paste it, Control V to paste again. So I've got 001, 002, and 003. And we will name our, let's do Control V one more time. We will call this drive rod targ.001. Now we've got some decent naming conventions here. The reason I'm making sure that I've got a good naming convention here is because I want to select this, 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 and this. Everything that we just rigged right here. And I'm going to go to edit mode, find my armatures, and I'm going to auto name left and right. You'll notice that it appended this .r to it. Now once that's appended to it, I can just simply, while keeping them still selected there, I can go to my armature again and do symmetrize. And what that's going to do is give me an identical set of bones on my left side. And all of those bones are going to be parented the same way and pointing in the correct, pointing at the right targets and whatnot. let me go to, must be this side, and that is going to save me just a ton of work. But we do have one little bit of an issue here. The right and left sides, their connection points are a little bit offset. Let me just get just these wheels here. You'll notice that that offset is down here on this side, and it's up here on this side. So even though it's going to save us a bunch of time setting up constraints and things like that, we are going to need to do a little bit of manual manipulation on this other left side here to reset these bones positions in the correct spot. So I won't actually do this in real time because I think that would be boring. Well, maybe I'll just do a couple here. Let me go to edit mode. Oops. I'm going to select this mesh right here. I think it's this point that I need. And this is why I'm not doing this in real time here. I think you would really get bored very quickly watching me do this over and over. Control L, Shift S, cursor to selected. That is going to be the center of that pivot point. And this is a lot of back and forth here. I want to take this head of that bone, that's the connection rod, Shift S, selection to cursor. Now I need to find this pivot point. Maybe it's that one. No, maybe it's this one. Shift S, cursor to selected. Now I want to make sure this is directly in line here. So that cursor actually put it in the center of this mesh. What I need to find is that X value of this, the head of this bone here. So X, I'm going to do Control C, and then I want to move this cursor over to that. Control V by pasting it into the X rotation there. Now I can snap the head of that bone. Oops. To that cursor. And I know this is a little bit confusing to look at here. That's the one. Shift S. Oops. Shift S. Selection to cursor. And also my target needs to be over there. So Shift S. I'll pick that target bone. Shift S. Selection to cursor to snap the whole thing over there. And like I mentioned, this is very boring to go in and out and keep doing that. Maybe it will be helpful if you see me do this in real time, but and maybe not. Let me actually take this bone and this head and do Shift S, selection to cursor, but I want them to be moved over on the X axis. So I need to find out where this point is. I'm going to select the head of this bone. Over here, find the X axis, Control C to copy that. Now I can paste the head over here. Control V. Where's my... These are sitting on top of each other. That's the conrod, that's the drive rod, that's the one I want to move over. V, there. So now I've got those bones in line again and pointing in the right direction at the correct pivot point. We take a look at this pivot point right here. I believe we need to have I believe we need to be over here. Let me select this. Shift S, cursor to selected. Once more, I'm going to wireframe. Yep, that looks like it's centered there really well. I just need to snap the head of this bone. Let me go back into edit mode here. This one needs to go over here. So Shift S, selection to cursor. And this should actually work here. I think I've got all my pivot points reset. Yep, that looks good. Now, make sure I'm on frame 1 here. I just need to attach my meshes to that. So let me just get this. I want to reparent this one, this one, this one, and this one. So I'm going to Alt-P, clear parent, keep transformation. Control A, apply the locations, rotations, and scales. Now let's get my armature back here and make sure that this mesh is parented to this one. This to this, Control P, bone. I want to parent this one to this one, Control P, bone. And just like on the other side, we want this rod and this rod to be parented to this central bone here that doesn't stretch, Control P, bone. And there we go. Now we've got it. We've got that offset here. Let me actually just turn off the armature so we can see everything working there. So I hope all that made sense. Pretty cool use of IK constraints. They're probably, like I said, they're the Swiss Army knife of constraints. Let me just do Alt-H to unhide anything here. I think we've got everything parented correctly, and everything seems to be working right. Since I'm getting towards 20 minutes again, I never seem to get as far as I would wish. All of this stuff in here is actually pretty complex, but we are going to do it the same way as we did out here. It's just going to be the use of IK constraints. So I'll keep that until next time. I'll see you later. Good luck.